Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, I'm going to talk to my friend Chris Sainty about the basics of cascading style sheets for Blazor developers. Now, spoiler alert, if you already know everything there is to know about CSS, you can move along to the next station. But if you're like many developers, you're probably a little confused by CSS and maybe even completely put off by it. And if that's the case, then this episode is for you. Chris has a way of explaining CSS that makes it easy to grasp. And we'll both offer up some great tools, libraries, and websites for dealing with CSS. And that will make you a better Blazor developer. Obviously, there's so much to CSS that we can only scratch the surface here today. But we'll be sure to get you on the right track.
That's only funny because it's so stupid.
And that's all coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train.
He's back. Chris Sainty is here from London again, back on Blazor Train. Hi, Chris. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. And just before we get started, I hear there have been some changes in your life recently.
Yeah, just a little bit. Yeah. My wife and I have had our first child. So yeah, life is great. Sleep, not so much. But I've got a good coffee machine, so it's okay.
So Child 1.0. It's a wonderful launch event.
Definitely, yeah. Blazing into the world, you may say.
Oh, my God. Terrible.
Bad jokes already.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. All right. So we're talking CSS, and what I wanted to do was give an overview. And I know CSS has been around for a long time, but I feel in my heart of hearts that there are so many corporate and other developers out there who have avoided JavaScript and CSS like the plague because, you know, let's face it, it requires a little bit more low-level thinking than a lot of application developers anyway are used to. And so, you know, if you were brought up on Visual Basic and Access and maybe Windows Forms and maybe struggled a little with WPF because that was a bit, you know, strenuous styling-wise and binding-wise. And now Blazor comes along and you're like, great, I got my language, I got my .NET framework. Now I got to think about CSS. What? So from the very beginning, Chris, the floor is yours.
Joyful joy. Right, CSS. Wowzers, where to begin? Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of those things that if you've not done it before, it's definitely an intimidating thing, I think, possibly coming into it. I think historically, it was definitely a bit of a minefield. We had lots of different browsers with lots of different engines that did different things with the same CSS rules.
Right.
And I think you and I have both been through the period of time where, you know, you did one thing in IE, one thing in Firefox, one thing in Safari, and you had to know all these different things to get something to look remotely similar across lots of different browsers. The good news is really that we don't have so many browsers anymore, so that's tidied things up a bit. And the CSS spec itself has matured a lot, and the browsers are now implementing things in a much more common way. Right. And for areas where there's sort of ways around it now. There's frameworks, one like Bootstrap, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which kind of do a lot of the heavy lifting for you and provide you a lot of pre-made classes that create a pre-made look. And that deals with all of the browser inconsistencies for you. And then you can just tweak it, which is a much nicer experience if you're new to doing CSS because the bulk of the heavy lifting done for you. You can just tweak the bits as you go, and then you can bite off as much as you want to at that particular point in time.
Being an object-oriented developer and then coming into the world of JavaScript and CSS, it's almost like, they both break the cardinal rules of object-oriented programming, which is global scope, right? We learned I learned a long time ago, you don't want global variables,
Yeah.
And so here comes CSS with this sort of global scope and JavaScript with global variables. And it seems like we took a step back in some ways.
Yeah, it feels a bit like it breaks like programming 101, doesn't it? It's a bit like that. Yeah, definitely. And that's certainly a problem with CSS. the name CSS, cascading style sheets, values cascade down. So how you name your classes and even the order that you put things in your CSS file, and also the order of your CSS files, can all have an impact on what particular CSS rules get applied to an element. Because sometimes, depending on what's going on, sometimes it's just the last rule wins.
Yeah.
So we can have a look at some little examples of that to kind of sort of make that concrete in our minds. In fact, that might be a good place to get going, actually, so we can understand those real fundamentals.
Right.
So, Carl, what I've got here is I've just got a brand new, this is a Blazor server application. It's actually a new Blazor server application using the .NET 5 RC1 preview, because I've been living life on that preview train for a long time now, and I'm not getting off. So we'll circle back around to this later on and talk about some of the cool new stuff in Blazor to do with CSS and scope CSS, which we'll discuss later on. Yeah. But for now, let's focus on the basics. So what we have in the basic template is in the www root folder, there's this CSS folder, and there's this site.css. So this is a default style sheet that's provided for us in the Blazor template. There's also another folder here with this bootstrap.min.css, and this is a CSS framework called Bootstrap. And again, we'll circle back to this in a moment. We're just going to start right at the very beginning for now.
Suffice to say, site.css is everything that has to do with the Blazor app specifically, right? In the template.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, essentially, we can have as many of these CSS files as we wish. So, there's no real convention to this. Some people call it site CSS. Some people call it main CSS.
Right.
It's really up to you, however you want to name your files. So we can put some styles in this one. We can put some styles in another one. Obviously, the more you have, then this whole ordering thing might become a problem. And there's other things to think about when you get into this a lot more. Like if you have lots of individual files, you have to download them to the browser, and a browser, I think, can only support 4 concurrent connections for downloading files from a server. So if you've got lots of files, it can slow down your app loading, and that's where fun things like bundling and minification come in, which we'll skip for now. But
Chris, I'm going to move over here if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem. Come join me over this side.
All right, I'm going to come over here. Can you just get some of this garbage out of the way?
Yeah, no problem.
All right, here I am.
So let's talk about some basics about how we actually style some elements and how we apply styles and what styles are and all this kind of stuff.
Okay.
So the default style sheet here is actually quite good for doing this because it's got quite a few different examples of some things, and we'll add a couple in as well. So the first most basic thing is we can style actual HTML elements directly. So
right.
HTML and body, for example, that we have here at the top. These aren't classes. These aren't anything special. These are literally referencing HTML elements.
Right.
So what this particular style here is doing is it's saying for the HTML and body tags, apply the following font family. Now, because they're the main container tags for your entire document, it's essentially setting the default font for your whole application.
Right.
So in this case, font family kind of takes a list of fonts that you want to use on the basis that the first one's the one you want to use as your primary one if it's available.
Right.
And then if that isn't available, then it will drop to Helvetica. And if that isn't available, it will go down to Arial. And eventually it drops down to any sans serif family font, basically. Right. That's what this bit's doing right here.
Sure.
But it's a great example, like I say, of one way we can style. So we can style directly on elements. So if we wanted as well, we could style something more random. So let's do that to just get an example of something. So we know this pretty well, the default Blazor template. What we'll do is we'll add a button. Let me just open up the index page. We'll just grab a button here. We're not going to have it do anything. We'll just put a button and we'll say, I'm a button. Now, we want to do something with, so we want to make it a certain color. Let's make it red, for example. How do we do that? Well, what we need to do, I'll take a step back. One thing we could do is actually we can style one of these elements directly. Now, we can do that using a style attribute. Now, when we do this, we can literally go whatever we want to set. So in this case, we're going to go with background color. There's a whole range. You can see it. Visual Studio is great, giving us IntelliSense.
Sure.
We get all these classes or properties, that we can style. So we're going to go with background color here, and we're going to say background color, then we put a colon, and then we give a value. So I'm just going to say red. Now, these are predefined colors. I could do a hex color if I want. So I could do something like FF6600, which is an orange. But we'll stick with red for now.
Okay.
If I do that and I hit save, I go back over to the browser and I hit refresh. This will just do a quick rebuild. And now you can see that we have a button with a nice red background.
So this is called inline styling, and it is looked very much down upon by modern web developers, is it not?
It is, yes. Yeah, this is one of these examples of this is something you can do, now don't do it.
Don't do it.
It's like everything, Carl. There's always there's a tool in the toolbox.
Yeah.
We can... There's always situations where these things can be useful. There's no absolutes in our industry.
Well, demoing is a good example because, you can see the result immediately. You don't have to go back and forth between a style sheet.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely. Yeah. And there's some scenarios where, and I'm talking much more advanced stuff now, but for example, in my Blazor libraries, we use these types of inline styles there because it's just the only way to get the dynamic behavior we need because we dynamically apply these and remove them on the fly. Yeah. And you just can't do it any other way. So like I say, there's always a use case for these things. But generally speaking, you should try to stay away from these.
So what you could do with inline styles in a component, let's say, is you could expose properties like background color as a string and then allow and as parameters, right? And then allow when you're defining your component instance, you could say background color equals red. And then in your style, you would say background color : at background color.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Should we just code that up real quick? Just have a look at it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, might as well. So what we'll do then is we'll create a real quick component here. We'll stick it in shared and we'll call it button. We'll do exactly what you've just said there. So we'll create a parameter like this. That can be a string. And we'll have that as background color. And then we'll take this code that we had before and we'll chop that out and we'll put it in here. And then instead of doing this, we'll do at background color. So we've got exactly the same thing as what we had before. We're going to render a button, except now we're going to be able to pass in the particular color of the background that we want to use.
Right.
So if I save this now and we go back over here, we can go button. But this is fine. By the way, it's probably worth just quickly pointing out that the reason this doesn't cause any conflicts is because this is a button with a capital B, so we don't interfere with the HTML element. Blazor components are case sensitive. So now we've got that, we can say background color here, and we'll say red like we did before. Mm-hmm. And what we can do for fun is we'll just stick a couple of extra bits in here, and we'll say yellow for that one, and we'll say green for this one.
Sounds good.
And if we save those, and we will come back here and refresh, and hopefully we should have some buttons that look like traffic lights. And we do.
Right.
So like you said, Carl, inline styles, that's a great example there where you could allow consumers of a component to specify particular properties for style. Right. So that's a good use case right there. So what we'll do is we'll go back over, we'll leave our button in place. We'll just make some updates to it. So the more correct, I'll say that in air quotes, correct way of doing this is actually to create a CSS style in a style sheet. That's the non-frowned on way. So if we go back to our site CSS, we can put that in here. So what we'll do is we'll start off by styling it directly. So we'll style the element itself. So what this is actually going to do now is it's going to affect every button in our application, because we're making this a global style, which harks back to what you mentioned a second ago about global variables.
Exactly.
So this is a good example of this. So if we say now background color, and we'll say red, like we had before. So what I can do now is I go back to this button. I'm going to remove this inline style. So now we have no styling on the button whatsoever. Okay, right. The style is in that style sheet instead.
Yeah.
So we've got that there. If we go back, refresh the application now.
They're all red.
You can see we've now got 3 red buttons. And any other buttons that we add to this application from now on, we're going to get red buttons. Okay, because global.
Right.
So let's have another go at this. Another way that we could style this, instead of styling the element itself directly, is we could actually make this what's called a CSS class. And a CSS class is something that starts with a dot. So that's what we can see down here on these other classes that are in this file. All these ones that start with a dot is a CSS class. So now what we're saying is anything that has a CSS class of button will get this background color of red.
And so, you might want to point out here that button is a very generic term. So when you're making your own CSS classes, probably a good idea to add in some special characters or something that identifies your stuff. So you don't step on anything else.
Definitely. In fact, we'll have a bit of fun with that in a second, actually. So what we could do now is we can go in here and we can say class equals, and now we can say button. So what we're doing here is we're using the class attribute and we're applying the particular CSS class that we want to use on this element, which is button, which matches that name there. You notice we don't have to use the dot here. We only have to use the dot when we're declaring it.
Right.
So if I save that now and we refresh the application, again, we still got red buttons because we still had red. So just to illustrate that I haven't cheated there, I'm just going to quickly make this blue just to make the point that wasn't anything like.
Sure.
cheating.
No smoke and mirrors here.
No smoke and mirrors. You see, we've got blue.
Yeah.
So in terms of what you just mentioned again about this global stuff. So what we can do is we can start to refine these classes using selectors. And this is a way of kind of scoping your CSS in a it's a fairly fundamental way, but it can be quite useful.
And scoping in this sense means what?
So it's saying that this particular class is only to be applied to elements that match a certain criteria. And in that criteria is a structural criteria of the actual document. So if I go back over to this index.razor, what we're going to do is I'm going to create a div now, and I'm going to say, what should we do? We'll say, add this div, and we'll say this has a class of, we'll call it container 1. I'll go like that for want of a more imaginative name.
Okay.
And I'm going to put the button in here. Okay.
Yeah.
And then what I'll do is I'll get rid of those ones, and we don't even need this background color now. So I'll get rid of that. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do that.
All right.
I'm going to call this one 2. I'm going to call this one 3. So we've got 3 divs now, and they've all got a class container 1, container 2, container 3. Now, these classes don't exist right now, and that's fine. That's not a problem. We don't actually need these to match anything. It won't cause any problems that we don't have any CSS classes that match them.
It just won't do anything. Yeah.
It just won't do anything. There's no styles to apply.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do is I'm going to take this container 1, and I'm going to put it in front of this button. And I'm going to say container 1 space button, and I'm going to say blue. So we'll leave that as it was before.
Okay.
And then I'm going to take a copy of that. See where I'm going with this?
Yeah, I do.
I'm going to say 2, and I'm going to say 3, and I'm going to say this time, that's going to be yellow, and that's going to be green.
Cool.
So what I'm saying now is in container 1, and I've missed some dots here, sorry. Got to get that right. So where there is an element that has a class of container 1, and that has an element, a child element within it, that has a class of button, apply the background color of blue.
Now, is that a class of button? So we have to specify class equals button on the button itself?
That is right now, but I tell you what, let's remove that.
If you remove that,
get
then
rid
it
of
just
that
applies to the DOM element button. All of them.
Exactly. So we'll go over here. We'll get rid of that as well out of here. So we've got rid of the class from everywhere. So we just have a button now.
Yep.
And that is contained within a div. And then each of those divs have those particular CSS classes. So if we save that now and we reload our application, hopefully we should see our traffic lights again.
Yeah.
Well, not traffic lights, because I've got a blue at the top, sorry.
That's a blue traffic light.
It's a blue traffic light, it's fine. So now we've got...
somewhere has a blue traffic light. And
there must be one somewhere.
There must be one.
So now what we've done is created a kind of namespacing for our CSS in it. So what we've done is been able to say that buttons within these certain structures will only get this particular color. So that's quite an important thing. And you can take that a long way. And there's quite a lot of different things you can do with this. So there's other kind of selectors for this. So for example, there is this selector, which, as my memory is correct, this means that any class anything element that has a class of container one and has a direct descendant of which is a button element will get a container background color of blue. Sorry.
So if the button is not inside another div, then it wouldn't. Yeah, I get it.
So hopefully I'll quickly demonstrate because I really hope I've not messed this one up. So if I put another div inside here and I put the button inside of this div, the button is now no longer a direct descendant of this element anymore because there's another div in the way.
Right.
So if we save that, let's see what happens this time around. You can see we've lost that styling. We no longer have a blue. So you can actually get quite specific with these selectors, and you can kind of really hone it down. And there's also sort of certain ways that you can do things with pseudo selectors. So you can select like the first child of the first child element. So if you've got lots of p tags inside a div, you can style the first occurrence of a p tag within that div, for example. And you can do that using, let's say, something called pseudo selectors. Right. So you can say like first child. So this would, if there was lots and lots of buttons, it would be the first child of a button would be styled with background color blue.
So first child is a known word.
Yeah, it's something called pseudo selectors. So there's quite a few of these in CSS, and once you start to get into it, you can do some sort of more advanced stuff with them. I won't go any further with them now because it's definitely getting into more advanced stuff. Yeah, but it's kind of just to let you know that those things are there when you're ready to get onto them.
Right, good.
So that's kind of a bit of a crash course in the basics of styling. One thing that I haven't mentioned is another way of applying CSS styles is using something called an ID. So, for example, on our buttons here, we've got multiple buttons actually. So I'm gonna, just to make this particular part make sense, I'm just gonna go back to using a standard HTML button instead of our component. Okay. So if I just plonk these back in here, we can specify an attribute on a HTML element called ID, and we can style these. So I can say this is a primary button. Yeah. One thing that's important to note about using IDs is that they have to be unique on a page. Yeah. So I have this button now with an ID of primary button. I now can't. Use that. I say can't. I say can't loosely. It will still work. The page will still load, but technically it's against the HTML specification. There should only be one ID on a page. Right. So
if you're doing stuff with JavaScript, get element by ID, it's only going to find the first one. So it's going to be a subtle bug that you won't be able to fix or won't be able to spot.
Precisely. Exactly. So what I could do here is I could have a secondary button. That would be perfectly fine. But I just can't have two primary buttons. But I can style those as well. So to go back over to our CSS, in order to do that, if I remove all of this now, I can say primary button like that, but instead of using a dot in the front, I can use a hash.
Yep.
And a hash basically means any element with this ID.
Yep.
So now I've got an ID of primary button, and I've got this other one here, so I'll do that. Secondary button, so blue and yellow. We'll save those and go back, and
so
we should get blue and yellow.
Except by
yeah, so you might have one. So depending, like for example, you might have an application that has a primary action button that always sits like in the bottom right corner or the top right corner that saves a CRUD form, for example, in a line of business application.
Yeah,
that button's on every page. You can give it an ID of primary button because there'll only ever be one on a particular page, and then you could just create that style in the style sheet, and that will make sure it gets applied. That will get then applied to every instance of that button across every page. So it's similar to what other principles in programming. It's just you don't have to sort of repeat yourself in any way.
Right.
ID selectors are probably less used. I'll be honest. I very rarely use ID selectors to style CSS. It's pretty much usually entirely classes and HTML elements.
Right. Very
rarely IDs. I think one example of doing that, actually, funnily enough, is styling custom logins on Azure B2C, because the elements on that use IDs. So you can style using IDs on that. That's one example, I think.
Can you show us the new coming in .NET 5 scoped CSS feature?
I can. So what we've talked about there is obviously talked about some sort of more simplistic scoping. But ultimately, that still can cause a problem, because if you've got a very, very big CSS file, it can be very easy to sort of miss a class declaration somewhere with its scope, and you end up repeating it somewhere else, and that breaks it. Or worse, you use a third-party library that has a style sheet, and that actually uses the same name as you do, and that overrides your class or whatever. So this causes a problem. And especially in component-based apps like frameworks, like Blazor and Vue and all the other JavaScript ones, they all have this same problem.
Right. So in your Blazor modal, for example, you probably had to create a class, a style sheet that had class names that everything started with Blazor modal or something, so that you're not taking a chance in stepping on anyone else.
Precisely, yeah. And there's a whole kind of what's the word, like pattern system built up around naming conventions in CSS. So Blazor modal actually uses a convention called BEM, which is block element modifier, and it's a way of creating names for CSS or scoping names for CSS. Based on this block element modifier approach. I won't go into that either, because that's the whole thing on its own.
But they're still global.
But they're still global. And you can do that, but ultimately if someone copies that same name, there's nothing you can do about it. It will still be there. So there's that fundamental problem. So what these JavaScript frameworks and Blazor have done is create this notion of scoped CSS. And what that does is a way of ensuring that any classes you write for a particular component will only work within that component.
Yes.
And there's some magic done by the compiler that enforces that and does it. And we'll have a quick exploration of that. Okay. So as I said, I'm using a .NET 5 template right now. And in that, there's already some examples of this. So the navmenu.razor that you would have seen before, that's still the same as it was before, except now it has this special nested file called navmenu.razor.css.
And can we bring that up above your picture so that everybody can see that in your...
Oh, yeah. Has that come above? No, hold on. Let me think how I'll move this over here for a second.
Okay, yeah, okay.
There we go. Is that come outside? There we go.
Yeah.
So we have this navmenu.razor.css. So this is a naming convention we have to use at the moment. So it has to be the name of the component .css, like this. And what's nice is in Visual Studio, it will create this nice nesting for us.
It's great.
So once we've done that, we can open this up. And this is just a normal style sheet, just like that that site.css we were just looking at.
Yeah.
Except the difference now is any classes that we define in this style sheet will only apply to our nav menu component. And Blazor is going to do some stuff to enforce that. What Blazor is going to do is it's actually going to generate a unique attribute onto the component in HTML, and that scopes the CSS using that unique name.
Nice.
I'll show you that in the HTML, in the compiled HTML, because I think it will be a little bit easier to understand. But it's based very heavily on Vue.js's implementation of scope CSS, which is really good. So it's a good model to go by.
Great.
So what we can see is we've got these various classes. So navbar toggler, top row, navbar brand, etc. And if we go over here, we can find those. So we've got, there we go, like navbar brand, for example, navbar toggler. So these are all in here. So if I go back over to our application now, and I right click and I inspect, if we go in here, we can see we've got these really funky, and let me just zoom in a bit here, my browser tools. These really funky names here.
Okay.
They look a bit random. These are actually created by the Blazor compiler at compile time. So what it does is it takes any component that has a scope CSS file, and then it generates these random identifiers, and then it uses them to scope all the CSS classes for that component. Nice. So you can see at the moment, if I go on page, for example, and I go over here and look at the style tab in my DevTools, you can see that the class is page. If you look here, it has this square bracket, and then we match the same random character string that's there.
Yeah, that's pretty smart.
That's basically how it's scoped, because now anything else that uses page won't match this because it won't have this randomly generated string to go with it.
Right. So
this flex direction row that's been applied now will only apply to the page class that's used within this component. And that's it. And because this doesn't happen till runtime, there's no way for you to guess what this could be, and it's randomly generated. So you know the chances of someone being able to collide with this is essentially zero. The only way you can do it is if you're trying to deliberately do it, which you know is a bit, that's cheating.
What are you doing?
So, exactly. And this all happens nicely automatically for you. You don't have to worry about any of this. You just create your nice, easy names that make sense to you. So coming back to our button one earlier on, for example, if we had all of our buttons in individual button components, we could style them using this scoped class system. And it would automatically, we could just use button in all of them, and it wouldn't matter. It would only apply to that particular component, which is great. And what Blazor does is it takes all of those scoped CSS styles and it actually bundles them all for you automatically. Excellent. And includes them in the head tag. So we can see here we have this scoped.styles.css. So Blazor collects all those individual files from the application and pushes them all together for us. So we have a single file. So if we go over to sources and we go over here, we can expand content and we can see that scope style. And you can see that this has been rewritten as well to match all of those unique bits. And that's all done automatically for you by Blazor. No heavy lifting at all. Just happens. So if we scroll down,
I got one thing to say about this, Chris.
Woo, woo!
Definitely. So there we go. There's all the bits we saw. Navbar brand, for example, we saw that earlier. So that's all taken care of for you. So it's great stuff.
I have to tell everybody about a great resource where I learned all the little details of CSS that, you know, when they crop up, like how do I do this? How do I do that? And it's not Stack Overflow, although Stack Overflow is pretty good, but it's W3 Schools.
Definitely.
W3 Schools. If you search for W3 Schools and then your CSS question, they've got a page for it, and they've got a live try it yourself page where you can change the source and then just run it, and you know, you'll get to see what the result is immediately. I love W3 Schools. Yeah,
it's a brilliant website. I still use it. It's fantastic.
Yeah. So we want to talk a little bit about Bootstrap, and you also have another one that you want to talk about, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. So let's start off with Bootstrap, because Bootstrap's included, it's bundled in with the default Blazor template, and it's probably one of the most popular CSS frameworks out there. So if we just start off, we can go to getbootstrap.com.
Yep.
And here we've got loads of great documentation. So what Bootstrap is, like I said, it's a CSS framework. So it's done lots and lots of stuff for you. So if we head over to documentation, we can go down, we can see, now this is called components. It's important here not to get this confused with Blazor components. These aren't the same thing. These are just, they're calling these components, but they're just pre-built CSS classes that create a certain look.
Right.
So we can see there's a lot here. You can see all these going down the side, lots and lots of examples of components. So, and this is how they work. So you can see these are all alerts that are shipped as part of the template. And then underneath, we've got some example code of how to actually implement them. Yeah. So what we do is we follow this structure of a div, and then we apply these particular classes that are provided by the Bootstrap framework.
Yeah.
And then all we have to do is do that. And without having to write any CSS ourselves, we get these lovely sort of formatted styles.
Yeah.
And what's really great about using a CSS framework like Bootstrap is that any of that cross-browser weirdness that I mentioned right near the start is taken away. They've already done that work for you to make sure that this alert will look exactly the same on Edge as it will on Chrome, as it will on Firefox and Safari.
And things just look better. Like if you use the Bootstrap, classes just for buttons and list boxes and text boxes, whatever, things just look better.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, look at our rather tired looking buttons over here.
Tired, yeah.
Using Bootstrap, we can really easily create sort of really like nice looking buttons straight away. So I can go in here and I can say class, and I can go BTN, and then I can go BTN-primary like this, which are some classes that are provided by Bootstrap. And now, if I refresh this, without having to do any CSS myself, boom, I've got a much nicer looking button than I had before.
And you can see that in the counter, the click, the click me
so
button.
If we go over here,
is button
there
primary.
It is. Yeah, and click away. So yeah, and that's the kind of thing you're getting with Bootstrap. You're getting this out of the box stuff done for you, so you can kind of get on adding value. And if you're not dealing with a site that needs a completely bespoke UI design, Bootstrap's going to get you a long, long way before you actually really have to worry about writing any manual CSS, which is really, really handy.
Yeah, and you can also download free themes that replace the Bootstrap min CSS file and just write over that, and then your whole application is styled, right?
Exactly, yeah. So again, off the Bootstrap site, you can go to Bootstrap themes, and then there's loads and loads of these themes here that are all using Bootstrap. Now, there's a mixture here. I think a lot of these ones on this particular ones on here are paid for, right? Because these are coming from Bootstrap themselves, and obviously it's a free framework, so this is a way of supporting them if you want to, and getting some really cool templates. But you can easily do free Bootstrap themes like that. And startbootstrap.com is a great example. So you can go on here, and there's lots and lots of pre-baked themes in here that you can use for free. And again, they do have some pro versions that you can go on to. Right. But for example, this one here, if we go on the live preview, this is using Bootstrap. This is using all the Bootstrap stuff, but it's just using, like you said, Carl, it's just they've applied their own sort of version of some of the components to create this more unique style.
So those class names are by convention going to be the same. What they've done is they've re-implemented what the details of those classes are. So your code doesn't have to change. You don't have to change the class names of anything. You just swap out one theme for another, and boom, everything is like magic.
Yeah, precisely. And this is that cascading effect that we mentioned earlier, and the key thing here will be making sure that their style sheet comes after the Bootstrap style sheet to make sure that it overrides those classes and applies the styles that it wants applied for that particular name. Right. So yeah, but it's really, really cool. As well as Bootstrap, there's some other frameworks as well that you can use. There's one called Bulma, for example, which is another very popular way of doing things. But they all have kind of the same thing in common. They create these pre-built components for you. So going back over to the docs again, you can see here we have things like this one's actually using some JavaScript, I think, but we have a carousel effect here that you can slide through and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's great. But one of the arguments against Bootstrap that some people have is that all Bootstrap sites look the same. You can tell if someone's used Bootstrap because it looks the same as a lot of other websites out there.
Right.
So one framework that I'm a big fan of that kind of breaks that mold is one called Tailwind. So Tailwind is a slightly different approach to this. So this is Tailwind CSS. Tailwind CSS is it's still a CSS framework, but it's called a utility-first framework. Okay. Now, this is really a very interesting change. So where we were creating those CSS classes before that we were setting property values on, so we were saying the background color should be red or blue or whatever, Tailwind turns this on its head and it creates very, very tiny CSS classes that only alter one property at a time. And then you compose those together to get the look and feel that you want. Wow. So you can see in this little GIF that's going on here, they've just applied lots and lots of little CSS classes that each control one particular CSS property. And then they've been able to create this nice looking and responsive card design using just those. Now, what's really interesting about Tailwind CSS is that you should theoretically, largely speaking, never have to write any CSS yourself. You will only ever compose those classes together. Exactly right.
Wow.
So
is there a lot to learn?
So there is, it's not loads to learn as such. It's more about learning their variable names or their class names. So you can see in the example here, you can kind of work out what a lot of this means. So you can see here for the email here, they're saying, well, the text should be gray and it should be have a brightness of 600. Okay. So all colors that are in Tailwind have a value of 100 up to 900. 100 being very, very light, and 900 being very, very dark.
Wow.
So this instance here is 600, so it's about medium. If I went 100, that would be really light. If I went 900, it'd be really, really dark. So you once you learn about how these things work and the naming conventions and stuff, actually becomes very, very quick to build stuff. Wow. Like really, really rapid. And they've got fantastic documentation. So you can see here, they're giving examples of, like, again, similar to Bootstrap. Here's what it looks like. Here's the code that makes it work. And as you scroll down the side, they kind of tell you about each of these individual classes and how you can do stuff with them. So if I go all the way down to width, for example, you can see that these are all the width classes that are included by default and what the value is they'll apply to your element. And you can go through and do this. If you want to get into this, it works really, really well with Blazor because you can encapsulate all of these composed classes into a component and then just reuse the component. And then you only declare all these classes in one place. And then if you want to change it, you just go to that one component. You can update your composed classes and then your whole app changes.
Can you do the sort of dynamic thing that we were talking about if I wanted to expose some of these things via properties?
Yeah, definitely. You could have some toggles there to say, sort of if someone had so let's go back over here, for example, and go back up to the top. Let's pretend, where do I want to go? Let me find an example. So say here, for example, we want to apply a couple of classes, container and MX Auto. It's not probably a great example. You might, instead of having them as hard strings like that, you might have like a Boolean value that says, apply container, true, false. And if it's true, you could then write a little C# expression to apply the container.
It might be class. Even easier to just have a class string and that you compose that string based on the properties that are being set, right?
Yeah, so you could have a string value. You could have the ability to pass in these composed classes by the consumer, so they get ultimate control over it, and you just apply whatever they've passed in.
And I would even go so far as to hide all these little variables and things from the consumer and just give them stuff like, rounded corners, radius equals, whatever. Give them all these properties. And as they're doing that and setting the properties, you're composing a string that translates that into Tailwind.
Exactly right. Yeah. And if you want to get going with it for Blazor, just as a shameless little plug, I did actually write a two-part blog series about how to get started with Tailwind. And this is an example of what we were just looking at, actually, where This is that BTN primary from Bootstrap. And this is how you would create the same thing in Tailwind using these composed classes. So you can see you can get very, very close to the same sort of styling.
Sure.
And again, I didn't have to write any CSS to do this. I just added these classes in. But that's a two-page series that takes you from nothing to having it working in your application, in your Blazor app. So yeah, that's definitely worth checking out.
Yay. Fantastic. Hey, man, I think this is a good place to leave it. So thank you. This is it's been eye-opening for me. I learned a couple of things, and I know that the listeners did too. So thanks again.
No, absolutely my pleasure.
All right. Back to you in the studio, Carl.
So the other night I couldn't sleep, and I had this idea that I could create some basic components with properties, events, and methods found in Windows forms. So I wrote a little project that wraps some basic UI properties like location, size, and text align, and does dynamic styling like Chris and I talked about. Now, don't get me wrong, it's just a couple lines of code, but it can be done. And maybe I'll show it off in a future episode. Maybe not. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time.
Blaze a trail.